everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the very last of our up-close talks. And today I'm delighted to share with you a story that's very close to all of us here on board. Now this is origin story. Now every story has its obstacles and its triumphs, allies and enemies, and of course a hero. Someone who doesn't only overcome obstacles, but also learns from them and ultimately becomes stronger. And here's what's amazing about heroes. We can watch them and we can learn from them about what it takes to survive, to grow, and to become great in our own way. Now in the story that I'm going to tell you, there are many amazing characters. There's a visionary businessman, a brave engineer, and even a ship that will change the world. But, well, there is only one hero. A hero that wasn't always the fastest or the strongest, but was often the smartest. Now this is the story of Holland America Line. So let's start with the Holland part. Now this is the Netherlands. And I know it's a little bit confusing, but the Netherlands is not the same as Holland. Holland is actually just a province, or technically two provinces, North and South Holland. So why Holland America Line? Well, because of this. Now this is Rotterdam. It's a city in South Holland, and today it's by far the busiest port in Europe and one of the largest ports in the world.
The Netherlands is of course located perfectly in Europe, as a gateway to Europe, we like to say, because the rivers go through to Germany, Belgium, France, and the whole of Eastern Europe.
Rotterdam is situated in a natural delta, and that means as a port, it caters to somewhat 350 million people. Until this day, trade comes into the port of Rotterdam, either in containers or goods, break bulk, and is then sort of divided into smaller portions and then taken upriver.
More than 100,000 ships pass through the port of Rotterdam, representing nearly 50 billion euros of value for the Netherlands every year. 50 billion. And just for perspective, well, that's 6% of the gross domestic product of the country, all from these 41 square miles of port. But in the 1800s, none of this was here. Rotterdam was a tiny city with a bit of a problem. And the river mouth was very shallow, and if a ship wanted to come into the port of Rotterdam, it had to take a long detour through canals and rivers. This added days to the journey, which wasn't good for business. And so a group of entrepreneurs, well, they got together and hatched a plan. They would dredge the river and make a new waterway to the sea. And this was a game changer.
In those days we had what we call the havenbaronnen, the port barons as we call them, entrepreneurs, people who were looking for opportunities. And later, Lodewijk Pincoffs and Otto Reuchlin, they started the North American Shipping Company.
They formed the company in 1873, and they called it this. Now, do Dutch speakers want to give it a try? No? Nederlandse Amerikaanse Stoomvaartmaatschappij. It just rolls off the tongue, right? Now, actually, in Dutch, the I and the J together are pronounced like a Y. Now, our first ship was called, of course, Rotterdam, and we painted her smokestack the colours of the city, green and white. The Rotterdam was actually built in Scotland, and it cost 30,000 guilders, which is millions and millions of dollars today. And she was supposed to have a big and splashy debut, but there was a strike at the shipyard, and she arrived 6 months late. Because of that delay, her first voyage was a little bit light, and she only carried 70 passengers. So it was an inauspicious start for our company. And actually, our first 20 years weren't, let's say, spectacular. And a lot came down to our name. See, it was quite hard to sell tickets in America on the Nederlandse Amerikaanse Stoomvaartmaatschappij. And everyone was calling us something else anyway. So we did what these days you would call a rebranding. And we went from this to this. And that's the last time that we were behind the curve. And by just a few years later, we had already taken over 1,000 trips with nearly 500,000 passengers. And things were only going to get better. Holland America Line was about to join one of the largest movements of people in the history of the world. For as long as America has been America, people have travelled from far away to make a new life in the United States. You see, before Holland America Line came around, it was difficult, it was expensive, and often it was extremely dangerous. In the early 1800s, before our steamships, the voyage across the Atlantic was pretty miserable.
Immigration from, of course, the point of view from the Netherlands started in the 1830s. Sometimes they sailed as regular passengers with their own cabin, but most of them didn't have a lot of money because poverty was a reason to migrate, and they stayed in between decks. So they didn't have their own cabin, they just stayed in whatever bed was provided for them.
The tween decks, or what you might know as steer, most of the immigrants travelled were tiny and they were extremely uncomfortable. They were actually only around 5 feet tall, so the same height as me. And the passage could take almost a month, and the condition was often miserable. By the time our steamships came around, things had gotten better. The trip was shorter, but the conditions on the other liners were still pretty terrible. And yet, well, here's the thing. Nearly 11 million people who immigrated to the United States did so in steerage. So we had to figure out a way to get some of those passengers. And look, it wasn't going to be easy. The competition was ferocious, especially because, well, the other companies were, let's say they were just willing to play it a little fast and loose with the truth.
It cost $10 to cross from Rotterdam to New York. $10 to an immigrant in the beginning of the 20th century was a lot of money. And they wanted the voyage that was safe and reliable. Immigrants were poor people, basically. They didn't go to travel agents, they didn't study brochures, but they'd go down to the railway station or the pub or the post office, and they would see these giant posters of liners going to America. So word spread that a ship with 2 smokestacks was safer than a ship with 1 smokestack. But a ship with 3 smokestacks was even safer. There's no correlation between smokestacks and safety, but they would look at the posters and count the smokestacks in the posters and pick that ship to spend their $10 on. Well, companies, thankfully Holland America didn't do it, used to add fake smokestacks to their ships. So they would have more stacks on the top so the immigrants would go on their ship, so they called them dummy smokestacks. The second big story of that era, the immigrants had heard that if they ate raw onions for a month before they left Europe, they wouldn't get seasick. Total fallacy. There's no correlation between raw onions and seasickness.
Okay, so first of all, we'd all really appreciate it if you don't try the raw onion cure. But the point is this. Holland America Line had to figure out how to get those immigrants on board our ships. And again, we weren't the fastest, we weren't the biggest, and we definitely weren't the cheapest. Oh, we definitely weren't going to cheat by adding fake dummy smokestacks to our ships. But despite all of that competition, eventually 1 out of every 10 immigrants who travelled steerage to the US did so on a Holland America Line ship. 1 out of every 10. And do you know why? Because we treated those immigrants like human beings deserve to be treated. And it all started at home in Rotterdam.
So here we're actually at the Wilhelminakade, but on this side it's called Holland America Quay. And this is the main street, you can say, in Rotterdam. So basically where we're at, this square kilometer is the history of Holland America Line. Just on the opposite side you have the Royal Yacht Club, where actually the deed, when it was started the company, was signed, dined and wined. If you walk a little bit up along the quay, you will find Hotel New York, which was the original head office of Holland America Line. And I have heard so many stories of people going there, trembling knees, and how happy they were when they finally got on board.
Now that building, which served as both our offices and terminal, is where it all started. And you can still see our name on the facade. Downstairs, the immigrants came to purchase their tickets and get ready for their long journey ahead. And actually the baggage area is now a really lovely restaurant with a gorgeous view. Upstairs were the offices, and today there are even a few rooms that were named after our founders. After the migrants purchased their tickets, they would wait for the ship to arrive and take them to America. And sometimes they would have to wait a few hours, but most of the time they would have to wait for days and days.
When they stayed in Rotterdam, up till the 1890s, they mostly went, or I think all of them went to private boarding houses, and in the earlier days, the people of the boarding houses, well, they were not that fair in the prices people had to pay. And people like Pleet and Heuglin, who were the founders of the Holland America line, also saw this. So at the end of the 19th century, they built their own emigrant hotel.
We built it just a few blocks away from our head offices, and it was a huge part of the reason that we were so successful in those early days. And this was much more than just a hotel. We had a kosher kitchen, English lessons, classes on American civics, and doctors and nurses who would check for lice and diseases. And finally, when the immigrant got on board, they found something totally different from our competition. And first of all, we did away with steerage class altogether, renaming it emigrants class, where, unlike our competition, we served 3 square meals in an actual mess hall every day to every passenger. Now, for example, well, here's a menu from the turn of the century. It looks pretty good, eh? Let's take a look at Monday. We've got sauerkraut, smoked bacon, potatoes, plum duff, and our first class passengers, well, they had it even better. We've got oysters on the half shell, seared duck. And by the way, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the name of that ship was the Potsdam, which is a non-Dutch name for a change. Now, it was inspired by a German town just south of Berlin, and it was chosen to provide a sense of familiarity to the immigrants travelling with us. You see, most of our immigrants came from Middle and Eastern Europe, and so the name Potsdam was given just to make their journey a little bit more comforting. But for obvious reasons, well, it's a name that's never been repeated. But we'll go back to the food for just a second. Because, well, offering 3 square meals a day in the dining room seems like a small thing. But actually, it was a massive innovation. Because it meant that 3 times a day, come rain or shine, those passengers would leave their quarters and their rooms could be cleaned. And because of this, very quickly we got the nickname the spotless fleet. And this wasn't just about being tidy. It was everything from the doctors at our hotel to the cleanliness on board our ships. And it was all about getting passengers to New York in healthy condition. Because healthy passengers, they make it through Ellis Island.
Just south of where I am right now is Ellis Island, the great immigration station, where from 1892 to 1924, 18 million people passed through. Now, the immigrants were not allowed to come up to the piers in New York. The ship had to drop anchor south of here in the lower bay, and they would take them off in barges, tenders, or ferries, and all the third-class steerage passengers would go directly to Ellis Island, where beginning at about 9 in the morning, they would be processed by gruff customs and immigration people and doctors known as 30-second specialists as they hooked under eyelids and poked into ears looking for diseases. They were processed, and many of them were cleared by noon, would catch a ferry over to Manhattan or even here to Jersey City and start working in a factory the same afternoon in a prearranged job. They wanted to be Americans quickly. They wanted the idea that the streets were paved with gold. You could make your riches in America.
By the way, if a passenger was rejected at Ellis Island, do you know who had to pay for the return voyage? We did. But that's only part of why we did all of this. The main reason was the people that made it through, they told their friends and their relatives about us. Almost 99% of immigrants that we carried on our spotless fleet were cleared at Ellis Island. Word spread about our fine service on board and business was exploding. So it was time for us to build our first luxury liner, the New Amsterdam. Now, I could gush about her, but I'm going to let the New York Times do the honors.
The New Holland America liner, New Amsterdam, reached Hoboken after her maiden passage across the Atlantic yesterday afternoon. The ship, which is the largest flying the Dutch flag, as well as the best passenger vessel yet built for the New York Rotterdam trade, resembles outwardly the other Holland America ships. There is a Dutch smoking room, a Japanese tea room. The social hall is furnished in the Empire style and will surely be one of the most popular apartments on the new ship.
Now that's what I call a good review, huh? And by the way, you might notice that the New Amsterdam had masts. Now it never used sails, but we put masts on our ship to assure worried immigrants that everything was safe and sound. It was sort of our version of dummy smokestacks, I guess. But it worked. Immigrants flocked to Holland America Line. The stories are endless. Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic athlete and the very first Tarzan, well, he emigrated to the States on Rotterdam 3. Herbert Hoover, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Clark Gable, Deborah Kerr, Louis Armstrong, they all travelled on Holland America Line ships. You know, we can even take the credit for some of the greatest comedies in the last 50 years. Billy Crystal's grandfather emigrated on one of our ships. So without us, well, there'd be no City Slickers, and Harry would have never met Sally. So you're very welcome. And of course, there's also this recognisable fella. Now, he travelled to the United States for the very first time on board one of our ships, the Rotterdam, the 4th Rotterdam, the flagship of our fleet and our very first ship of state. The Rotterdam 4 was built in 1908, and she was amazing. She was the largest ever Dutch ship. She was the official seagoing palace of the Royal Dutch Government, which is sort of the Dutch version of the SS France or the Queen Mary, and she was the first ocean liner in the world to have a glass-enclosed promenade deck, which might not seem like a big deal, but it was 4 more years before another ship had such a modern and forward-looking feature, and that ship was the Titanic. Actually, the Titanic is part of our story in more than one way. In 1912, when White Star Line launched the Titanic, one of our founders sent his son George to scout the new ship. He dined with the ship's designers and he met with officials from White Star Line. And he sent telegrams to the captain of the Noordam, a Holland America Line ship that was crossing the Atlantic just ahead of the Titanic. The captain of the Noordam actually warned him of the ice ahead, and if you listen very, very carefully in the film, you can hear our ship mentioned. But of course, it was no help. Our founder's son was among the 1,500 that perished on that tragic voyage. But that tragedy wouldn't stop us. World War I didn't stop us, or immigration quotas, not even prohibition. We just continued to do what we had always done. We found a way to think differently.
In 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the passenger ship industry to Europe plummeted by 50%. A million people crossed in 1930, 500,000 5 years later. So Holland America, like all the companies, was hemorrhaging money. So in America, we had prohibition, you couldn't drink. So they developed an idea of one-night cruises for $10, where you would sail from New York at 5 p.m. You would get to the 3-mile limit at 7 p.m. They could open up the bars legally because they were past the 3-mile limit. America could drink themselves through the whole night and hopefully be sober enough to walk ashore the next morning. $10 booze cruises. Cruising was like Hollywood movies in the 30s. It was a form of escapism. So Holland America emphasized the nutrients in sea air. It would calm your nerves. You would worry less about your financial troubles. You'll come back renewed.
Our
That was
approach
the
to
original
prohibition
booze
was
cruise.
so successful that despite the Great Depression, we built our most luxurious ship ever, the New Amsterdam II, which is still considered to be, along with the Normandy of France, one of the most beautiful ships ever built. And again, I'm going to let the New York Times handle this one.
British observers who landed at Southampton after making the overnight journey to inspect the ship were deeply impressed with her, not only as the most modern thing in marine architecture, but also as a distinct and unique achievement in art. The New Amsterdam is the greatest ship ever to come out of Holland, and those who have seen her predict that she will produce a sensation in New York unlike that of any other vessel in the North Atlantic trade.
Sensation is the perfect word for New Amsterdam II. She was our very first ship to feature something called ocean liner design. You see, before the New Amsterdam, our ships looked like home. They had dark interiors with fireplaces and heavy fabrics. You were supposed to feel like you were in a Dutch villa and not out at sea. But with New Amsterdam II, we tried something different.
It was Art Deco at sea, it was magnificent, it had everything right about it. It was floating ginger arches with sleek stainless banisters and ebony and modern decor, out with the chocolate rooms and the heavy carpets. She was instantly one of the most popular ships. In fact, she was dubbed the ship of tomorrow because she was so modern inside.
With New Amsterdam II, we even revolutionized entertainment on board. In the early days, our lounges featured a piano for guests to play, just like parlours of the old country. That was the onboard entertainment. A few drinks in the hope that someone else crossing the Atlantic with you could play a few popular songs. Well, now we still do the few drinks things, but we provide the piano player, and that all started on New Amsterdam. It even had an entire theatre, so New Amsterdam also featured performances by all kinds of artists. And fast forward 100 years, we went from this to this. The past was gone. The ocean liner was the future. But less than a year after New Amsterdam made her first voyage, everything changed.
War breaks out in Europe. 2 days after Germany's surprise attack on Poland, France and England have declared war on the Nazis. With widespread fighting imminent, Catholic civilians are left to wonder, where will we go that is safe?
My parents smuggled themselves, literally smuggled themselves across the Polish border in early '39.
We arrived at the Rotterdam train station around midnight on the 25th of March, without any money at all. We spent 2 weeks in Rotterdam waiting for the ship to sail. Finally, one evening in early April, we boarded our ship. For the first 3 days, our vessel threaded her way carefully across the English Channel to avoid the mines.
It was tense all the way. There were frequent rumors of U-boats and of turning back to Europe. At night, the ship was blacked out, dark. The portholes had been painted over, drapes and curtains were drawn by late afternoon, and only low wattage bulbs were used in the lounges and in the cabins.
We were in the English Channel, and the war had started, and the ship turned out all the lights, and we laid all night in the English Channel because of fear of submarines. And then the next day we started the trip to New York, and partway through the trip we saw the ocean all around us was covered with logs, and it was a Canadian lumber ship that had been torpedoed by the Germans, and we picked up the survivors.
On the day we finally rounded Land's End and headed out into the open Atlantic, the ship's radio brought us the news of Hitler's surprise attack.
Rotterdam was bombed, the whole city center was bombed. Around 850 people lost their lives. Around 30,000 people lost their home, which is a lot. And also the harbor, the port was bombed.
During the bombardment, one of our largest ships, the Rotterdam, was hit, and in the midst of destruction, the symbol of our company burned for days and days.
A lot of people were emotional about it. That Rotterdam was, it was burning, and they tried to save it, but they couldn't. The whole city center of Rotterdam was burning. I mean, 30,000 buildings were gone. You can't imagine how it must have been for people to live in the city at that moment. All those people having no homes, the fire, there was no water. Everything was broken. It must have been awful.
The Dutch government had wanted to be neutral, but now they had no choice. The war had come to the Netherlands, and so they called on all Dutch ships of state to join the war effort. New Amsterdam II, our most luxurious ship yet, was to become a military vessel, and so she steamed over to Halifax, and that's where her military conversion began. From there, she went over to Singapore, where her millions of dollars of furniture and art were placed into storage. And on December 22nd, 1940, she entered service.
At the outbreak of World War II, I was in South Africa.
Now that was Cecil Renfield, and when we interviewed him, he was 97 years old. He joined the Navy in South Africa, and he was transferred to the British Royal Navy to join the battle for Europe. The only way that he could get home to fight was on board New Amsterdam.
Before the war, I was a cabin boy on the old Orient line, and I knew a lot about merchant ships, and I knew about the New Amsterdam. Was, I would say, the pride of Holland in those days. Wow, it was the biggest ship I'd ever seen or ever been on. When we got on board that troop ship, it was packed. We were packed like sardines. You lifted your head up, you cracked your head on the bunk above you.
All of the troop carriers were extremely crowded, and New Amsterdam was no different. Before the war, she could carry little more than 1,200 passengers. But during the war, at her capacity, she held over 8,000 troops at a time. Even the swimming pools were filled with enough bunks for 300 soldiers. And despite the cramped conditions, New Amsterdam maintained the world-famous Holland America Line service. An example, while most troop carriers only managed 2 hot meals a day, soldiers travelling on board our New Amsterdam were treated to 3 square meals. The amount of food needed to feed these soldiers was quite frankly mind-boggling. Now, every single day, the ship kitchens went through 240 gallons of milk, 80 bags of flour, over 12,000 eggs, 1,000 pounds of bacon, 14,000 loaves of bread. Now, when lamb stew was on the menu, it took 110 whole lambs. And when beef brisket was served, it took 4,000 pounds of beef. Now, by the way, just for comparison, well, these days we use about 5,000 fewer eggs. We, on the other hand, have way more lobster tails, and ice cream, and booze. But what Cecil remembers isn't the brisket or the eggs. It's actually something much simpler.
The feeling of fear was always back in your mind. We'd heard through what we call the grapevine of so many other ships being sunk. And it was quite strange because on the New Amsterdam, we had no escort. There were no ships with us at all. We just sailed alone.
But the New Amsterdam was very fast and the German U-boats couldn't keep up with it. So she escaped. Being painted gray, she could slip into fog or disappear on the horizon.
By the time the war was over, New Amsterdam had steamed over 500,000 miles, carrying almost 400,000 troops, including tens of thousands for the invasion of Normandy. Only the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth carried more troops than our New Amsterdam, and they were twice her size. Now, after the war was over, it took 13 months to return her to her former beauty, and it cost nearly as much as it did to build her in the first place. But it was worth it, because when she finally returned home to Rotterdam, what awaited her was what can only be described a hero's welcome.
In 1946, 1 year after the war ended, it returned to Holland, and it steamed into Rotterdam, still scarred in rust of the grey paint, and to the Dutch people, it was the symbol of liberation more than anything else, and they painted the Holland America stacks in the yellow, green, and white, and the people dubbed it the darling of the Dutch. We are truly free. The New Amsterdam has come back to Holland.
And the ship was welcomed like you would welcome a queen or a president. The new waterway in the river, there were a lot of ships really with flags and people alongside the quays really welcoming the ship back. And in a way you can say that for at least the people from Rotterdam, war really ended at the moment that the New Amsterdam was back in this city.
Of our 20-ship fleet, only 10 survived the war. One of them, Westerdam, was sunk 3 times, and yet she was the first ship to return to New York after the war was over.
In 1946, when the Westerdam was the first liner to come back after the war, she sailed right on this path on the Hudson River. It probably was early morning at 7 a.m. Maybe a tugboat or two or a flyboat escorted her up the river. She was dressed in flags, and she slowly made her progress up to Hoboken, which would be a little further north than where I am right now, in Jersey City. But she'd make a graceful sight, and she looked pretty against the New York City skyline. You know, the new ship, morning, wonderful, a beginning.
It was the end of the war and the start of a whole new era. Okay, so something we haven't spoken about yet is the thing that we do with the names of our ships. So first of all of our passenger ships end with the word dam, and when we had cargo ships, they all ended with this, dike, as in the things that stop the water from flooding a city. So I'm telling you this for a reason, because the names of our ships are very, very important to us. They're so important, in fact, that we repeat them over and over and over again. There have been 3 Volendams, 3 Rhindams. We've had 4 New Amsterdams, 5.5 Statendams. One is technically a new Statendam, but it still counts. But why do we do all of this? Now, do you remember what I said in the beginning about how stories help us learn from our past? They help us become stronger from our failures and wiser from our victories. Well, how do you do all of that? You do it by remembering, and by honouring the past that continues to shape our future. And it matters. It really matters. Now, on New Statendam's maiden voyage, we met a man who you actually heard earlier, and he escaped the Nazis in 1939 on Statendam 3. He chose to cruise on the New Statendam all of those years later so that he could reconnect to his past. Now, in this way, our ships become time machines. They are receptacles of your memories and your family's memories. They echo with the voyages of the past. But of course, there's been one name that we have returned to more than any other: Rotterdam. There have been a lot of Rotterdams in our history. We had 4 ships named Rotterdam before our company was even 40 years old. But of all of the Rotterdams, there is none more important to our story, none that better illustrates our hero's journey than Rotterdam 5, the Grand Dam of the Spotless Fleet. Now here she is in September 1958, and 50,000 people line the banks of Rotterdam shipyard to watch Queen Juliana christen her. She was stunning. She was the first ship to really and truly look like a modern cruise ship.
The Rotterdam was so unique, she didn't have a smokestack. She had twin uptakes on the outside, and her decor was very, very modern. Ships were becoming more like floating hotels. Gymnasiums, swimming pools, shopping arcades, movie theaters. They were becoming really hotels at sea, or resorts at sea. And the Rotterdam was one of the great statements of, well, extraordinary maritime design for her period.
And when we talk about extraordinary design, we have to talk about one of Holland America Line's greatest contributions to cruising, the Lido Cafe. You can step in from the pool, grab a bite to eat, and then go back to your sunbathing. So once again, you're very, very welcome. Now, she was the future, but her timing was terrible. Only a month after she was launched, the world changed again.
In October 1958, the first jet flies from London to New York. The shipping industry announces flying is a fad, it will pass. It's a mere ripple in the road of travel. In 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of all the business. In 5 years, 98%.
That plane only took 6 hours to cross the ocean. 6 hours. A trip that ocean liners made in 6 days. And quite frankly, that should have been the end of our story. If not for Rotterdam 5. Because just like we had innovated in the past, every detail of Rotterdam 5 seemed to predict the ends of the transatlantic business and the beginning of something new. Now take, for example, her staircase. There was a movable partition between that could be closed to create the first class and a tourist class for transatlantic crossings, or we could open it and create a single class ship, which was perfect for cruising. Now, even the first and the tourist class dining rooms were identical. The first class dining room was just a little bit closer to the kitchen, so your food would have been a little bit warmer. But Rotterdam 5 was a huge success. She cruised the West Indies, the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and in 1961, she began a yearly tradition of circumnavigating the world.
Some people would take the world cruise every year. It was like a floating clubhouse. They'd bring their own favorite foods, their own furniture, so they'd feel at home. It was magic. There were all sorts of stories. The lady who took 300 dresses for 95 days. What about the lady who took 2 suites? One was for her heart. What about the lady who took a second suite for her stuffed animal collection, which she traveled with around the world?
The best, though, is the lady that brought her plastic surgeon. Can you imagine? She left for a 95-day cruise and she came back looking 20 years younger. Talk about a time machine, eh?
She's also one of those ships that was beloved, a certain kind of chemistry that you don't build in the shipyard, but it's in the woodwork and the paneling. It just engulfs people, so passengers and crew love that ship.
And if you truly want an amazing time machine experience, Rotterdam 5 is now a floating hotel in Rotterdam Harbour. You can go on board, you can walk her halls, you can see the beautiful design, you can touch the steam engines, you can see the saltwater pools, you can explore the past right in front of you. Honestly, it is breathtaking. But do you want to know what my favourite thing is? Now, every single time that we call into the port of Rotterdam, we blow our horn in salute as we pass by that grand old ship. Because Rotterdam 5 was so much more than just a beloved ship. She was the thing that allowed us from being a fleet of ocean liners that occasionally cruised to making cruising the entirety of our business. But by the time the 60s rolled around, we had entered a new battleground in the cruising industry. As other fleets were making the same adjustments that we were making, we found ourselves once again in competition for passengers. So we had to find a unique advantage, and we had to do it fast. Because the 60s might have been swinging, but the 70s brought around oil embargoes and financial crises. And suddenly, we had major choices to make. And the first thing that we did was we shuttered our cargo operations altogether. We have had about 80 cargo ships in our history, but from that moment on, we would never have another one. And things were starting to look bleak. Alec Case explained. Back in the 70s, he was on one of our last few passenger ships in operation, Prinsendam.
There were only 3 or 4 passenger ships left, and that was not enough to sustain the company and pay for the overhead. So it was felt that we need to offer new and exciting adventures. In the mid-1970s, the company was associated with West Tours, a very successful tour company here in Alaska. So they decided, we're going to bring that Prinsendam to Alaska.
That's right. While the rest of the world was focusing on cruising the warm waters of the Caribbean, we took one ship, one of our last ships, and we sent it thousands of miles in the wrong direction.
I was on the Prinsendam. That was the very first ship slotted to go to Alaska. Alaska was different, very, very, very different than it is now. If you walked into Juneau, there were no jewelry shops like you find everywhere in the Caribbean. There were no tour buses. We used school buses. That was all what was available in those days. If Sitka had 3 taxis, then it was it.
Also, there was another problem. Prinsendam was in Asia, and so she had to get across the Pacific to start her first Alaskan cruise, which was rather tricky in the days before GPS and computer-guided navigation.
This was supposed to be a 10-day North Pacific crossing, and this was in April. And we left Yokohama, and it was dense fog. Couldn't see anything for days. So here we go, basically the old-fashioned way, dead reckoning. You estimate how fast the ship is going, you know your course, and you plot in the chart, every day where you are. So I'm on the bridge, and I look on the radar, and I look outside, and I look on the radar again, and I see land. It's not supposed to be land for at least another day, to our estimate. So I called the captain, and I said, "Captain, oi, land in sight." He said, "What the hell are you talking about? It's not 1650, it's 1975. He said, "Come on the bridge, I see land." And he saw these snow-capped mountains, from Vancouver Island.
They had arrived a full 24 hours early. Do you remember what I said about never being behind the curve again? Well, it's kind of amazing that we were way ahead of schedule for our very first Alaskan cruise, because we were way ahead of everyone else when it came to Alaska, and it paid off. Thousands of people flocked to explore this new destination. So many, in fact, that we had to start bringing ships over from New York to the West Coast.
The ships needed to move from New York to Vancouver, and that's a long way. So we needed to come up with a cruise to do that make it attractive for people to say, "Hey, I've never been with a ship through the Panama Canal. Hey, there are interesting ports down in the Caribbean that we normally don't go to." The company always found a way to persevere. It's hard to say you did well when times are difficult, but it's not how you go in, but how you come out.
And in just a few years, we became an Alaska powerhouse. We bought a train, a resort. We helped transform Alaska into what it is today. It's amazing, really. That one idea, Cruise Alaska, it changed everything. The jet plane almost ruined us, but just by taking risks and by stepping out of what was difficult and comfortable, we survived. And don't get me wrong, jets are amazing. They can get you all over the world, but they can't show you this up close. Alaska was so successful that despite the economic disaster of the 70s, we were planning to expand our fleet by 2 more ships. But then something happened. In the late 80s, Alaska put us on the radar of a small company in Florida. You might have heard of them? Carnival? And our partnership with Carnival immediately paid off. And instead of 2 ships, we took delivery on 12 ships in 12 years. Each one a purpose-built cruise ship. Each one built in the Fincantieri shipyard in Italy. Each one a symbol of how far we had come. Each ship was a symbol of our commitment to go further, deeper, to connect people to new experiences and to make new stories. And it's a big idea and a lot of responsibility. A responsibility that we take very seriously. In 2020, we encountered a global tragedy that affected the lives and the communities everywhere, and it totally disrupted the cruising industry. In all of our history, the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the biggest challenges that we have ever had to face. As the world ground to a halt and governments raced to respond, we knew what we had to do. First of all, we had to get our guests home, and to be honest with you, it was very hard. It was one of the hardest things that we have ever had to go through. But as hard as it was, we were committed to doing everything and anything that it was going to take. And it took every single one of us, but we got it done. But our work wasn't over yet. After we got our guests home, we turned our focus to our team members, thousands of people who have come from all corners of the globe. Holland America Line joined the largest peacetime repatriation effort in the history of the world. With planes grounded to a halt and borders closed, it took unprecedented cooperation and nearly 4 months, but finally we got them home. And to be honest with you, when you need to move thousands of people, thousands of miles, and air travel is no sure thing, it's a really great time to have your own navy. Now this photo was taken in June 2020. And there we are with dozens of other ships over in Manila Bay. And eventually we had ships all over the world, where we waited, and we mourned, and we hoped for a light. And now that we're here, back together at sea, we are perhaps most importantly, once again hopeful for the future. Now do you remember what Case said? It's not about how you go in, but how you come out. So how do we come out of all of this? Well, we have always believed that there's a power in travel. It binds us together, it helps us dream, and it helps us forge new memories. And now, more than ever, we are embracing our past as we move forward with a new beginning. And what a better way than as often as we have done before, with a new 7th Rotterdam. Our first ship to launch after the pandemic, named like so many before her, after our home. And a reminder of our resilience, and an expression of hope that while there are times of hardship, there are also many journeys that do lie ahead. And to help her in this mission, the newest Rotterdam, like every other Holland America Line ship before her, has someone very special looking over her. For thousands of years, ship captains of nearly every single world culture have looked to the heavens to help ships protect them against the unknown. Now, as recent as just a few hundred years ago, women were carved into the bows of the ships to give the captains better sight. Now, we do something a little different. We have godmothers. Our tradition started with our very first ship, Rotterdam, and she was dedicated by the captain's daughter. Our second was again godmothered by the captain's daughter. And since that day, every single ship that we have had a godmother looking over her. We have had actresses, television personalities, we've had athletes, we have even had the Olsen twins. We've had 11 members of the Dutch royal family, 4 princesses and 4 queens. Queen Wilhelmina dedicated New Amsterdam too. And by the way, at one time, Queen Wilhelmina was the richest woman in the world, and she was actually the very first female billionaire. Our royal family might not be the flashiest, but they certainly are one of the wealthiest, and one of the most beloved. When Queen Juliana christened Rotterdam 5, 50,000 people showed up to watch. Her daughter, Queen Beatrix, was the godmother of 2 of our ships, Stavendam 4 and the one and only Rotterdam. Our current queen, Queen Maxima, she not only watches over New Amsterdam, but she also watches over our lovely Koningsdam. And this ship was named for her husband, King Willem-Alexander, who was the first male monarch of the Netherlands in over a century. We welcomed Oprah Winfrey into our family of godmothers when she dedicated Nieuwstad Dam in February 2019, sending her on the trip of a lifetime. And Rotterdam 7, our newest flagship, is blessed by Princess Margriet, who holds the record for the most Holland America Line ships christened, and she proudly continues this rich tradition. Our hero story has lasted for over 150 years, and it has been extraordinary. We have survived 2 world wars, the death of the ocean liner, a Great Depression and multiple economic crises. We have circled the globe, we've carried generations of passengers, and we've seen the birth of countless eras. So what do we learn from all of this, besides some fun historical tidbits? Well, there's an old saying. The pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, and the realist adjusts the sails. Now I know it's a little bit corny doing sailing metaphor on a ship, but this one works, because it perfectly sums up the journey of our hero. Every change, every difficulty, every era, we have observed, we've learned, and we've reflected. And then we've made the adjustments that have put us where we are today, 151 years later, stronger and wiser, and ready to continue taking people to new worlds. Now I want to leave you with some of the last words from Bill Miller, because I think he puts this whole thing pretty well.
It's or steel or carpets or artwork. It's the magic that somehow that a ship has when it comes in the beginning that just extends to everybody, and they just love it. They've been a wonderful family. They've been my friends. I've watched them come and they go, their life stories. It's like a great big maritime soap opera with all these actresses playing these parts. And when I put my little head on the pillow at night, I think, the ships are still here, thank God. It's wonderful.
And so, on behalf of 1,000 current team members of Holland America Line and all those who have come before, I thank you for coming today. And more important, I thank you for being part of our story. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your cruise. Thank you.
Okay, time to hit the buffet.